All right, joining me now, live from London, here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show, is Ian Cobain. Ian is a senior reporter for The Guardian. He is the author of the great new book, A Secret History of Torture. You can find Ian at guardiannews.com and on Twitter at Ian Cobain. Ian, thank you so much for being on the show.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
So, Ian, let me begin by asking, what exactly led you to write this book, A Secret History of Torture?
Well, my work with The Guardian involved me trying to find out more about the UK's involvement in the US rendition programme and the support for that programme, which we only really started seeing signs of it around 2004, 2005, and every question I asked of the British government officials and ministers was always met with a blanket denial, and they refused to get into any of the specifics, and some ministers described any suggestion of UK support for the rendition programme as being little more than a conspiracy theory. And we now know that that's completely false. The British were very much involved. First of all, in offering logistic support, use of airspace and overflight arrangements and refuelling for aircraft. But then the British, once they had in place policies that allowed them to cooperate with the US authorities in this way, they then started making use of it and arranging for people who were of interest purely to the British and not to the United States so much to be detained by questionable intelligence agencies and sometimes rendered. And very early on, the British were arranging for British citizens to be consigned to Guantanamo. Our knowledge of this we had to piece it together very slowly, but it came together over 2007, 2008, 2009, and we can now see that the British were deeply involved in the rendition program.
It's so much so, like at the beginning of your book, you have and it's something I think even us in America had that same problem where you have to ask yourself, does my country not only obviously torture now because the evidence is staring us in the face, but is this something that actually has been going on for generations? And that actually led you to the book where we actually looked and actually discovered that this isn't something that is just started post 9/11, where we live in a post 9/11 world where we have to torture. You actually found that Britain had been torturing for a long, long time.
Yes, whilst making these inquiries about British involvement in the rendition programme, I came across in a book review in the London Times one Saturday morning a veiled reference to a place called the London Cage, where somebody who'd been working for the British during the Second World War had been sent to be interrogated during the Second World War. And I thought that's an interesting sounding place. So I did a quick internet search, and there was nothing on the internet at that time about this place called the London Cage. There is now. And I went down to the National Archives, the British government's National Archives, and started going through the whole declassified files. And eventually I managed to piece together the story of how the British had run this secret interrogation centre right in the heart of London throughout the Second World War, where Germans were tortured. And not only it didn't stop, it didn't cease operating in 1945, it was still operating in early 1949, where alleged war criminals were being sent to extract confessions, and also more junior German soldiers who were being lined up to act as prosecution witnesses in war crimes trials were also sent there to be tortured. And I found this fascinating, really, because I, like a lot of people, had assumed that the British were fighting a pretty moral war in 1939 to 1945, and whilst there may have been battlefield excesses, that we didn't systematically torture our enemies. And I'm afraid we did, not on a big scale, but we did use systemic torture during the Second World War.
And as you said, it was actually happening right in London, right at a Victorian house in London.
In a row of Victorian houses next to Kensington Palace, which eventually became Princess Diana's home. So right in the heart of London.
Unbelievable. I'm talking to Ian Cobain, the author of A Secret History of Torture. So around the 1940s, not only was it happening at a Victorian house, it was also happening at a place called Camp 020 or Camp 020. Discuss that.
That was the second place that the British opened in 1940, and it was run by MI5, the security service. And eventually, a great many Nazi agents passed through there and were very persuaded to very quickly change their allegiance and start sending radio messages back to Germany and Holland. Under control of the security service. Very successful counter-espionage operation. But the very first people who went there were British fascists. and it's now quite clear that people were tortured here as well. Perhaps no surprise, the scale of the threat to the United Kingdom in the summer of 1940 was enormous. People thought we were about to be invaded. So it would kind of be a surprise if we weren't resorting to torture at that time.
Yeah. And then it also extends in the late 1940s, after World War II. You actually write about how torture was happening in Kenya. What happened? What exactly happened in Kenya?
Well, yeah, it did extend in the night. There was a third organisation that tortured people essentially in the Second World War. There was the MI5, the Army ran the London Cage, and the War Office ran its own network of prisons across occupied Europe, occupied Germany and other places, North Africa, after the war. And then the British started to find to see, as the British started to retreat from empire, being forced out very often, rather than relinquishing territory, the British fought a series of counter-insurgency battles. Some of them were incredibly brutal. The one in Kenya was the one which was very difficult for the British to understand the nature of the enemy because it was such a vicious enemy that they were encountering, and they fought the Mau Mau insurgency through torturing people in the most appalling fashion. And it's now acknowledged. Just late last year, the British government finally acknowledged that the British authorities did torture people in Kenya after denying it for decades and decades. But are still seeking to prevent the victims from obtaining an apology and a degree of compensation.
Mm-hmm. And it wasn't just Kenya; it actually expanded into Cyprus.
Cyprus,
in the 1950s.
Same decade, with the same methods were then exported to Cyprus, where the British fought an insurgency, unsuccessfully fought an insurgency against nationalist guerrillas from 1955 onwards, and the evidence for that is actually in the Red Cross's archives. The Red Cross wasn't at all active in Kenya. The Red Cross was active in Cyprus, and it's quite clear from their archives, which are now accessible, that they documented a great deal of torture by the British, including what we now call waterboarding and a great many more brutal methods that the British employed in their desperation to hang on to this territory, which was seen as being vital to British interests in the Mediterranean. And then after Cyprus, we had the retreat from Aden in the south of what's now the Yemen. And again, the declassified documentation shows that the British were resorting to the most appalling methods of trying to extract scraps of information, scraps of intelligence from this enemy that the British didn't really understand.
I'm talking to Ian Cobain, the author of the book A Secret History of Torture. In the 1950s, then, Ian, some very cruel experiments begin in what you call a chapter in your book you describe a barbaric assault on the human mind. Tell us about that, because that this is when all this is horrible, but this is also a certain type of depravity.
Yeah, it's clear that very often the British resorted to torture through fear and a degree of misunderstanding about the nature of their enemies. During and towards the end of the Korean War, it became clear that a number of prisoners of war, particularly British and American prisoners of war, of the Chinese, didn't really want to come home. Their loyalties had been transferred in some way. There became this belief that the Chinese and others in the East had developed what were known then as brainwashing techniques. They were concerned about its use in Hungary as well as in Korea. And the British were persuaded by colleagues in the United States and in Canada, interestingly, to form a three-way series of experiments which were designed to develop interrogation techniques which amounted to brainwashing. And what they established during the course of the 1950s is that sensory deprivation is a very effective means of breaking down, first of all, an individual's will to resist, and secondly, an effective means of breaking down the personality. You can induce psychosis really very quickly through the use of sensory deprivation. And this was employed. The British then developed a series of very simple interrogation techniques which depended principally on the use of sensory deprivation.
And this is what's referred to as the 5 techniques? Is that what that is?
That's right. So the British, they developed them slowly over 1945 to about 1970. And the 5 techniques were hooding, to induce sensory deprivation, and noise, the use of noise. There's also the use of sleep deprivation, starvation, and then the fifth technique was the use of stress positions. And the position favoured by the British at that time was forcing individuals to lean with both hands against the wall, supporting most of their weight on their hands. The reason why they use these techniques is because they left no mark. That's one of the reasons. Another reason why they use them is because they were inexpensive, they were easy to teach, and you can employ them at the front line. You can employ them in the middle of a busy city during a counterinsurgency. And it's worth stating that there was a sixth unspoken technique. The British formally called them the 5 aids to interrogation. 5 techniques in aid to interrogation. There was a sixth unspoken technique, which is that anybody who refused to assume a stress position would be beaten.